Your body is made up of elements. The stars are made up of elements. The chair you're sitting at is made up of elements. All the same elements, just put together in a different way. I find this important to remember, to relay back to as we study five-element theory in Chinese medicine, because it's that microcosm, macrocosm remembrance, coming back to the big scope versus getting so tunnel visioned into theory. Always remember to take a step back and look at the big picture. On that note, the five phases, Wu Qing, is an attempt to classify phenomena in terms of five quintessential processes represented by the emblems wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. And its place in Chinese medicine, as well as many other intellectual pursuits, have been misunderstood ever since the first Occidentals were applied to explain Chinese natural philosophy to the West over 300 years ago. During this century, the academic world has made some advances towards a better appreciation for five-element theory. And the Chinese term that we use to translate five phases, Wu Qing, Wu is the number 5 and Qing means walk or move. It perhaps implies a process as opposed to an element itself. It's important to think of element in a different way that we normally think of it in English, more a movement, a process. And the theory of the five phases is a system of correspondences and patterns that subsume events and things, especially in relationship to their dynamics. Each phase is in an emblem that denotes a category of related functions and qualities. The phase wood is associated with active functions that are in a growing phase. Fire designates itself to functions that have reached a maximum state of activity and that are about to begin to decline or a resting period. Metal represents functions that are in a declining state, and water represents functions that have reached maximal state of rest and are about to change. In this approach, we look at the elements in forms of positioning and movement, like physics. Finally, earth designates balance or neutrality. Earth is the buffer between other phases. The five phases correlate observable phenomenon of human life into images derived from the macrocosm. Like I mentioned before, they serve a similar function as that of the elements in other medical systems. And the five phases can be used to describe an annual cycle in terms of biological growth and development. Wood corresponds to spring, fire to summer, metal to autumn, and water to winter. Earth, what is that? That's the transition state. It's where the chi of the body goes back inward in between the seasons, which is why our immune systems tend to get weak and there are flu season, seasonal colds, because our body's defense is actually going inwards and we don't have as much defense on the exterior in those transition cycles. The five phases or five elements were not documented until the 4th century BCE, and some imitation of the five phases can be found in many writings around the period from 500 to 200 BCE. It was a time of great intellectual and political social ferment in China. So the emphasis of the theory of the five phases was as much political as it was scientific. And the first dated systemized theory of the five elements was by someone named Zhou Yan, approximately 350 to 270 BCE. It was created by him and his followers. The five-element theory did receive quite a bit of criticism in its early stages, especially due to the challenges in its practicality or veracity. But despite their early criticism, the five-phase theory became an important framework in Chinese medicine. One reason for this is that the Chinese investigative study tends to be inductive only to a point and then proceeds with deductions based on the classics. The 4 classics that I mentioned on my page, the Huangdi Jing Su Wen, Ling Shu, the Jingui Yaolue, the Wenbing, and the Shenghan Lun. The way I look at the five-element theory is that it's like one of the many tools to have in your tool belt as a doctor of Chinese medicine. When you are in a practice and you are treating people, maybe it's not the best approach for every pathology, but there are certain pathologies where the five-element theory comes in perfectly. It's always better to have more tools in your belt than less. The application of the five elements or phases to seasonal growth is only one example of how the system was used. There are corresponding elements to the seasons. There are also 5 generic categories for classifying many more perceptions from colors, sounds, odors, tastes, sensations to emotions, animals, dynasties, and even the planets. Ultimately, everything in the universe has a corresponding element. The correlations that were also made between the phases and the various organs and anatomical regions of the body were basically how the connection between phases of the 5 elements in medicine came about. I find it really interesting because in Chinese medicine, there's colors and tastes pertaining to organs. There's also an element that's pertaining to each grain and planet, like I said, sound. So definitely take a screenshot of the chart. It's in this video. The 5 phases are often used to describe clinical processes and relationships and to help in the conceptualization of proper treatments. The 5 phases are also used to describe general processes that take place during the annual cycle. The mutual production order of wood, fire, earth, metal, water describes normal generative functions. In that sequence, the producer is called the mother and the produced is called the child. Some patterns of disharmony can be explained by reference to the mutual productions order, especially patterns of deficiency. As I'm writing out here, in case of deficiency, tonify the mother, and in case of excess, sedate the child, which is the treatment principle for the 5-element theory. The child of a deficient mother, for instance, becomes deficient for want of proper nourishment. Conversely, when the child is deficient, it may steal the chi of the mother, making it deficient as well. If an organ is deficient, the treatment can be affected by strengthening the mother organ. When there's an excess of an organ or in the organ, the child can be drained. The concept of treatment is important in acupuncture, but is seldom used in herbal medicine. Another sequence that goes around the star, not in a circle, but in a clockwise around the star shape, is known as the mutual checking or mutual controlling order. I call it the mutual or overacting sequence. There's many names for one thing in Chinese medicine, which can be confusing, but you just have to memorize them all and know they mean the same thing. The control order, like the mutual production order, describes naturally occurring phenomena, and it ensures that the mutual production order does not overgenerate and cause imbalances. A disharmony within the control order might mean that an organ is exerting excess control over the organ that it regulates, and this would lead to a deficiency in the regulated organ, or the organ that should be regulated may become the regulator. So other situations can arise, but these are the 2 most likely. The former imbalance is known as the insulting cycle, or you can also call it the counteracting sequence or cycle, and the latter as the overacting sequence. The counteracting sequence, which goes the opposite way of the overacting sequence. And that's how these elements and organs can affect each other. You have the mother that promotes the son. The mom can overact on the son, and the son can counteract on the mom. Under normal conditions, water promotes wood. Abnormally, water affecting wood is known as mother affecting son, and wood affecting water is known as the son affecting the mother. And definitely memorize your chart. Make and memorize your chart of the mom and sun points, as well as the 5-element points, and always refer back to the treatment principle. In case of deficiency, tonify the mother. In case of excess, reduce the sun. The 5 elements and the 5 tastes. The sour taste goes to the liver. The bitter taste goes to the heart. The sweet taste goes to the spleen. The pure or pungent taste goes to the lungs. The salty taste goes to the kidneys. If the liver is diseased, one should not eat pungent foods. If the heart is diseased, one should not eat salty foods. And this is from the Spiritual Access, or the Spiritual Pivot, the Ling Shu. In Chinese medicine, we say if an organ is diseased, one should avoid the taste related to the element that controls that organ along the controlling sequence. For example, the salty taste pertaining to water. Water overacts on fire, and therefore an excess of salt may injure the heart. So it can get quite complex, but always refer back to your 5-element theory. And lastly, I'm going to give you a little preview on a video that I will be posting in a while, maybe a couple weeks, on a detailed video on the emotions from Giovanni and how they relate. It talks a lot about Zong Fu 5-element theory, so stay tuned for that. But here's a little preview. The 5 elements, as we talked about, each have a corresponding emotion. And those emotions in excess or deficiency can become pathological. Liver pertaining to anger. We know that too much excessive anger is a bad thing. But with joy, with the heart, it's like, well, how can too much joy be a bad thing? Well, it can be, somebody who's unhealthy, their immune system's shot, they have a bad diet, maybe they're already old age, they win the lottery, they get so excited and they have a heart attack and die. These things actually happen, right? So there is an amount of excessive, and I'm talking extreme excessive joy that can be pathological. So we get into detail about stuff like that, and talk about their Chinese names, the yi pertaining to the spleen, that's thinking, pensiveness. Obviously, too much thinking, pensiveness can injure, weaken the spleen. So we go into the 5-element theory and how we can, and it talks about how salt, even though salt pertains to the kidneys, too much salt can damage the heart, like from a Western medicine perspective. And I go into detail about that. So stay tuned for that video. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe for all my latest content. Have a great weekend.